Section 1 of Early Kings of Norway. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Early Kings of Norway by Thomas Carlyle. Section 1, Preface, Chapters 1 and 2. Preface. The Icelanders, in their long winter, had a great habit of writing, and were, and still are, excellent in penmanship, says Dahlmann. It is to this fact that any little history there is of the Norse kings and their old tragedies, crimes, and heroisms is almost all due. The Icelanders, it seems, not only made beautiful letters on their paper or parchment, but were laudably observant and desirous of accuracy, and have left us such a collection of narratives, sagas, literally, says, as for quantity and quality, is unexampled among rude nations. Snorro Sturluson's history of the Norse kings is built out of these old sagas, and has in it a great deal of poetic fire, not a little faithful sagacity applied in sifting and adjusting these old sagas, and, in a word, deserves, were it once well edited, furnished with accurate maps, chronological summaries, etc., to be reckoned among the great history books of the world. It is from these sources, greatly aided by accurate, learned, and unwearied Dahlmann, the German professor, that the following rough notes of the early Norway kings are hastily thrown together. In histories of England, Rapin's excepted, next to nothing has been shown of the many and strong threads of connection between English affairs and Norse. Chapter 1. Harald Haarfagre. Till about the year of grace 860 there were no kings in Norway, nothing but numerous jarls, essentially kinglets, each presiding over a kind of republican or parliamentary little territory, generally striving each to be on some terms of human neighbourhood with those about him. But in spite of fylketings, folkthings, little parish parliaments, and small combinations of these, which had gradually formed themselves, often reduced to the unhappy state of quarrel with them, Harald Haarfagre was the first to put an end to this state of things, and became memorable and profitable to his country by uniting it under one head and making a kingdom of it, which it has continued to be ever since. His father, Halfdan the Black, had already begun this rough but salutary process, inspired by the cupidities and instincts, by the faculties and opportunities, which the good genius of this world, beneficent often enough under savage forms, and diligent at all times to diminish anarchy as the world's worst savagery, usually appoints in such cases. Conquest, hard fighting, followed by wise guidance of the conquered, but it was Harald the Fair-haired, his son, who conspicuously carried it on and completed it. Harald's birth year, death year, and chronology in general are known only by inference and computation, but, by the latest reckoning, he died about the year 933 of our era, a man of 83. The business of conquest lasted Harald about 12 years, A.D. 860 to 872, in which he subdued also the Vikings of the Out Islands, Orkneys, Shetlands, Hebrides, and Man. 60 more years were given him to consolidate and regulate what he had conquered, which he did with great judgment, industry, and success. His reign altogether is counted to have been of over 70 years. The beginning of his great adventure was of a romantic character. Youthful love for the beautiful Gyda, a then glorious and famous young lady of those regions, whom the young Harald aspired to marry. Gyda answered his embassy and prayer in a distant, lofty manner. Her it would not beseem to wed any jarl or poor creature of that kind. Let him do as Gorm of Denmark, Eric of Sweden, Egbert of England, and others had done. subdue into peace and regulation the confused, contentious bits of jarls round him, and become a king. Then, perhaps, she might think of his proposal. Till then, not. Harald was struck with this proud answer, which rendered Gyda tenfold more desirable to him. He vowed to let his hair grow, never to cut or even to comb it till this feat were done, and the peerless Gyda his own. He proceeded accordingly to conquer, in fierce battle, a jarl or two every year, and at the end of 12 years had his unkempt and almost unimaginable head of hair clipped off. Jarl Rognvald, Reginald, of More, the most valued and valuable of all his subject jarls, being promoted to this sublime barber function. After which King Harald, with head thoroughly cleaned, and hair grown or growing again to the luxuriant beauty that had no equal in his day, brought home his Gyda, and made her the brightest queen in all the north. He had after her, in succession, or perhaps even simultaneously in some cases, at least 6 other wives, and by Gyda herself 1 daughter and 4 sons. Harald was not to be considered a strict living man, and he had a great deal of trouble, as we shall see, with the tumultuous ambition of his sons. But he managed his government, aided by Jarl Rognvald and others, in a large, quietly potent, and successful manner, and it lasted in this royal form till his death, after 60 years of it. These were the times of Norse colonization. Proud Norsemen flying into other lands, to freer scenes, to Iceland, to the Faroe Islands, which were hitherto quite vacant, tenanted only by some mournful hermit Irish Christian fakir or so; still more copiously to the Orkney and Shetland Isles, the Hebrides, and other countries where Norse squatters and settlers already were. Settlement of Iceland, we say; settlement of the Faroe Islands; and by far the notablest of all, settlement of Normandy by Rolf the Ganger, A.D. 876. Rolf, son of Rognvald, was lord of 3 little islets far north, near the fjord of Folden, called the 3 Vigton Islands. But his chief means of living was that of sea robbery, which, or at least Rolf's conduct in which, Harald did not approve of. In the court of Harald, sea robbery was strictly forbidden as between Harald's own countries, but as against foreign countries it continued to be the one profession for a gentleman. Thus I read, Harald's own chief son, King Eric that afterwards was, had been at sea in such employments ever since his 12th year. Rolf's crime, however, was that in coming home from one of these expeditions, his crew having fallen short of victual, Rolf landed with them on the shore of Norway, and in his strait drove in some cattle there, a crime by law, and proceeded to kill and eat, which, in a little while, he heard that King Harald was on foot to inquire into and punish. Whereupon Rolf the Ganger speedily got into his ships again, got to the coast of France with his sea robbers, got investment by the poor King of France in the fruitful shaggy desert which is since called Normandy, land of the Northmen, and there, gradually felling the forests, banking the rivers, tilling the fields, became, during the next 2 centuries, Wilhelmus Conquestor, the man famous to England and momentous at this day, not to England alone, but to all speakers of the English tongue, now spread from side to side of the world in a wonderful degree. Tancred of Hauteville and his Italian Normans, though important too in Italy, are not worth naming in comparison. This is a ferocious earth, and the grain of mustard seed will grow to miraculous extent in some cases. Harald's chief helper, counsellor, and lieutenant was the above-mentioned Jarl Rognvald of More, who had the honour to cut Harald's dreadful head of hair. This Rognvald was father of Turf Einar, who first invented peat in the Orkneys, finding the wood all gone there, and is remembered to this day. Einar, being come to these islands by King Harald's permission, to see what he could do in them, islands inhabited by what miscellany of Picts, Scots, Norse squatters we do not know, found the indispensable fuel all wasted. Turf Einar, too, may be regarded as a benefactor to his kind. He was, it appears, a bastard, and got no coddling from his father, who disliked him, partly perhaps because he was ugly and blind of an eye, got no flattering even on his conquest of the Orkneys and invention of peat. Here is the parting speech his father made to him, on fitting him out with a longship, ship of war, dragon ship, ancient 74, and sending him forth to make a living for himself in the world. It were best if thou never camest back, for I have small hope that thy people will have honour by thee. Thy mother's kin throughout is slavish. Harald Haarfagre had a good many sons and daughters. The daughters he married mostly to jarls of due merit who were loyal to him. With the sons, as remarked above, he had a great deal of trouble. They were ambitious, stirring fellows, and grudged at their finding so little promotion from a father so kind to his jarls. Sea robbery by no means an adequate career for the sons of a great king, two of them, Halfdan Halleck, Longleg, and Gudrod Leome, Gleam, jealous of the favours won by the great Jarl Rognvald, surrounded him in his house one night, and burnt him and 60 men to death there. That was the end of Rognvald, the invaluable Jarl, always true to Haarfagre, and distinguished in world history by producing Rolf the Ganger, author of the Norman Conquest of England, and Turf Einar, who invented peat in the Orkneys. Whether Rolf had left Norway at this time there is no chronology to tell me. As to Rolf's surname, Ganger, there are various hypotheses. The likeliest, perhaps, that Rolf was so weighty a man, no horse, small Norwegian horses, big ponies rather, would carry him, and that he usually walked, having a mighty stride withal, and great velocity on foot. One of these murderers of Jarl Rognvald quietly set himself in Rognvald's place, the other making for Orkney to serve Turf Einar in like fashion. Turf Einar, taken by surprise, fled to the mainland, but returned days or perhaps weeks after, ready for battle, fought with Halfdan, put his party to flight, and at next morning's light searched the island and slew all the men he found. As to Halfdan Longleg himself, in fierce memory of his own murdered father, Turf Einar cut an eagle on his back, that is to say, hewed the ribs from each side of the spine, and turned them out like the wings of a spread eagle, a mode of Norse vengeance fashionable at that time in extremely aggravated cases. Harald Haarfagre, in the meantime, had descended upon the Rognvald scene, not in mild mood towards the new Jarl there, indignantly dismissed said Jarl, and appointed a brother of Rognvald, brother notes Dahlmann, though Rognvald had left other sons. Which done, Haarfagre sailed with all speed to the Orkneys, there to avenge that cutting of an eagle on the human back on Turf Einar's part. Turf Einar did not resist, submissively met the angry Haarfagre, said he left it all, what had been done, what provocation there had been, to Haarfagre's own equity and greatness of mind. Magnanimous Haarfagre inflicted a fine of 60 marks in gold, which was paid in ready money by Turf Einar, and so the matter ended. Chapter 2. Eric Bloodaxe and Brothers. In such violent courses, Haarfagre's sons, I know not how many of them, had come to an untimely end. Only Eric, the accomplished sea rover, and 3 others remained to him. Among these 4 sons, rather impatient for property and authority of their own, King Harald, in his old days, tried to part his kingdom in some now becoming burdensome to him. To each of them he gave a kind of kingdom. Eric, his eldest, to be head king, and the others to be feudatory under him, and pay a certain yearly contribution, an arrangement which did not answer well at all. Head King Eric insisted on his tribute. Quarrels arose as to the payment, considerable fighting and disturbance, bringing fierce destruction from King Eric upon many valiant but too stubborn Norse spirits, and among the rest upon all his 3 brothers, which got him, from the Norse populations, the surname of Blot Axe, Eric Bloodaxe, his title in history. One of his brothers he had killed in battle before his old father's life ended. This brother was Bjorn, a peaceable, improving, trading economic under-king, whom the others mockingly called Bjorn the Chapman. The great-grandson of this Bjorn became extremely distinguished by and by as Saint Olaf. Head King Eric seems to have had a violent wife, too. She was thought to have poisoned one of her other brothers-in-law. Eric Bloodaxe had by no means a gentle life of it in this world, trained to sea robbery on the coasts of England, Scotland, Ireland, and France, since his 12th year. Old King Fairhair, at the age of 70, had another son, to whom was given the name of Hakon. His mother was a slave in Fairhair's house. Slave by ill luck of war, though nobly enough born. A strange adventure connects this Hakon with England and King Ethelstan, who was then entering upon his great career there. Short while after this Hakon came into the world, there entered Fairhair's palace, one evening as Fairhair sat feasting, an English ambassador or messenger, bearing in his hand, as gift from King Ethelstan, a magnificent sword, with gold hilt and other fine trimmings, to the great Harald, King of Norway. Harald took the sword, drew it, or was half drawing it, admiringly from the scabbard, when the English excellency broke into a scornful laugh. "Ha ha! Thou art now the feudatory of my English king. Thou hast accepted the sword from him, and art now his man." Acceptance of a sword in that manner being the symbol of investiture in those days. Harald looked a trifle flurried, it is probable, but held in his wrath, and did no damage to the tricksy Englishman. He kept the matter in his mind, however, and next summer little Hakon, having got his weaning done, one of the prettiest, healthiest little creatures, Harald sent him off, under the charge of Hawk, so called, one of his principal warriors, with order, take him to England, and instructions what to do with him there. And accordingly, one evening Hawk, with 30 men escorting, strode into Ethelstan's high dwelling, where situated, how built, whether with logs like Harald's, I cannot specifically say, into Ethelstan's high presence, and silently set the wild little cherub upon Ethelstan's knee. "What is this?" asked Ethelstan, looking at the little cherub. "This is King Harald's son, whom a serving-maid bore to him, and whom he now gives thee as foster-child." Indignant, Ethelstan drew his sword, as if to do the gift a mischief, but Hauk said, "Thou hast taken him on thy knee," common symbol of adoption. "Thou canst kill him if thou wilt, but thou dost not thereby kill all the sons of Harald." Ethelstan straightway took milder thoughts, brought up and carefully educated Hakon, from whom and this singular adventure came before very long the first tidings of Christianity into Norway. Harald Haarfagre, latterly withdrawn from all kinds of business, died at the age of 83, about A.D. 933, as is computed. Nearly contemporary in death with the first Danish king, Gorm the Old, who had done a corresponding feat in reducing Denmark under one head. Remarkable old men, these two first kings, and possessed of gifts for bringing chaos a little nearer to the form of Cosmos, possessed, in fact, of loyalties to Cosmos, that is to say, of authentic virtues in the savage state, such as have been needed in all societies at their incipience in this world. A kind of virtues, hugely in discredit at present, but not unlikely to be needed again, to the astonishment of careless persons, before all is done. End of Section 1. Early Kings of Norway.
Chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3. Hakon the Good. Eric Bloodaxe, whose practical reign is counted to have begun about A.D. 930, had by this time, or within a year or so of this time, pretty much extinguished all his brother kings, and crushed down recalcitrant spirits, in his violent way, but had naturally become entirely unpopular in Norway, and filled it with silent discontent and even rage against him. Hakon Fairhair's last son, the little foster child of Athelstan in England, who had been baptized and carefully educated, was come to his 14th or 15th year at his father's death, a very shining youth, as Athelstan saw with just pleasure. So soon as the few preliminary preparations had been settled, Hakon, furnished with a ship or two by Athelstan, suddenly appeared in Norway, got acknowledged by the peasant thing in Trondheim, the news of which flew over Norway like a fire through dried grass, says an old chronicler. So that Eric, with his queen Gunhild, and 7 small children, had to run; no other shift for Eric. They went to the Orkneys first of all, then to England, and he got Northumberland as earldom, I vaguely hear from Athelstan. But Eric soon died, and his queen with her children went back to the Orkneys in search of refuge or help, to little purpose there or elsewhere. From Orkney she went to Denmark, where Harold Bluetooth took her poor eldest boy as foster child, but I fear did not very faithfully keep that promise. The Danes had been robbing extensively during the late tumults in Norway; this the Christian Hakon, now established there, paid in kind, and the two countries were at war, so that Gunhild's little boy was a welcome card in the hand of Bluetooth. Hakon proved a brilliant and successful king, regulated many things, public law among others, Gulthing law, Frosthing law; these are little codes of his accepted by their respective things, and had a salutary effect in their time. With prompt dexterity he drove back the Bluetooth foster son invasions every time they came, and on the whole gained for himself the name of Hakon the Good. These Danish invasions were a frequent source of trouble to him, but his greatest and continual trouble was that of extirpating heathen idolatry from Norway, and introducing the Christian Evangel in his stead. His transcendent anxiety to achieve this salutary enterprise was all along his grand difficulty and stumbling block, the heathen opposition to it being also rooted and great. Bishops and priests from England Hakon had, preaching and baptizing what they could, but making only slow progress, much too slow for Hakon's zeal. On the other hand, every Yuletide, when the chief heathen were assembled in his own palace on their grand sacrificial festival, there was great pressure put upon Hakon, as to sprinkling with horseblood, drinking Yule beer, eating horseflesh, and the other distressing rites, the whole of which Hakon abhorred, and with all his steadfastness strove to reject utterly. Sigurd, Jarl of Lade, Trondheim, a liberal heathen, not openly a Christian, was ever a wise counsellor and conciliator in such affairs, and proved a great help to Hakon. Once, for example, there having risen at a Yule feast loud, almost stormful demand that Hakon, like a true man and brother, should drink Yule beer with them in their sacred high tide, Sigurd persuaded him to comply, for peace's sake at least in form. Hakon took the cup in his left hand, excellent hot beer, and with his right cut the sign of the cross above it, then drank a draught. "Yes, but what is this with the king's right hand?" cried the company. "Don't you see?" answered shifty Sigurd. "He makes the sign of Thor's hammer before drinking. which quenched the matter for the time. Horseflesh, horse broth, and the horse ingredient generally, Hakon all but inexorably declined. By Sigurd's pressing exhortation and entreaty, he did once take a kettle of horse broth by the handle, with a good deal of linen quilt or towel interposed, and did open his lips for what of steam could insinuate itself. At another time he consented to a particle of horse liver, intending, privately I guess, to keep it outside the gullet, and smuggle it away without swallowing, but farther than this not even Sigurd could persuade him to go. At the things held in regard to this matter Hakon's success was always incomplete; now and then it was a plain failure, and Hakon had to draw back till a better time. Here is one specimen of the response he got on such an occasion, curious specimen withal of antique parliamentary eloquence from an anti-Christian thing. At a thing of all the fylks of Trondheim, thing held at Frost in that region, King Hakon, with all the eloquence he had, signified that it was imperatively necessary that all Bonders and sub-Bonders should become Christians, and believe in one God, Christ the Son of Mary, renouncing entirely blood sacrifices and heathen idols, should keep every seventh day holy, abstain from labor that day, and even from food, devoting the day to fasting and sacred meditation. Whereupon, by way of universal answer, arose a confused universal murmur of entire dissent. "Take away from us our old belief, and also our time for labor," murmured they in angry astonishment. "How can even the land be got tilled in that way?" "We cannot work if we don't get food," said the hand laborers and slaves. "It lies in King Hakon's blood," remarked others. "His father and all his kindred were apt to be stingy about food, though liberal enough with money." At length one Osbjorn, or Bear of the Ossen or Gods, what we now call Osborne, one Osbjorn of Metalhusen Gullithal, stepped forward, and said in a distinct manner, "We Bonders, peasant proprietors, thought, King Hakon, when thou heldest thy first Thing day here in Trondheim, and we took thee for our king, and received our hereditary lands from thee again, that we had got heaven itself. But now we know not how it is, whether we have won freedom, or whether thou intendest anew to make us slaves, with this wonderful proposal that we should renounce our faith, which our fathers before us have held, and all our ancestors as well, first in the age of burial by burning, and now in that of earth burial; and yet these departed ones were much our superiors, and their faith too has brought prosperity to us. Thee, at the same time, we have loved so much that we raised thee to manage all the laws of the land, and speak as their voice to us all. And even now it is our will and the vote of all Bonders to keep that paction which thou gavest here on the Thing at Frost, and to maintain thee as king so long as any of us Bonders who are here upon the Thing has life left, provided thou, king, wilt go fairly to work, and demand of us only such things as are not impossible. But if thou wilt fix upon this thing with so great obstinacy, and employ force and power, in that case we Bonders have taken the resolution, all of us, to fall away from thee, and to take for ourselves another head, who will so behave that we may enjoy in freedom the belief which is agreeable to us. Now shalt thou, king, choose one of these two courses before the Thing disperse." Whereupon, adds the chronicle, all the Bonders raised a mighty shout, "Yes, we will have it so, as has been said," so that Jarl Sigurd had to intervene, and King Hakon to choose for the moment the milder branch of the alternative. At other things Hakon was more or less successful. All his days, by such methods as there were, he kept pressing forward with this great enterprise, and on the whole did thoroughly shake asunder the old edifice of heathendom, and fairly introduce some foundation for the new and better rule of law, and life among his people. Sigurd, Jarl of Lade, his wise counsellor in all these matters, is also a man worthy of notice. Hakon's arrangements against the continual invasions of Eric's sons, with Danish Bluetooth backing them, were manifold, and for a long time successful. He appointed, after consultation and consent in the various things, so many warships, fully manned and ready, to be furnished instantly on the king's demand by each province or fjord; watchfires, on fit places, from hill to hill all along the coast, were to be carefully set up, carefully maintained in readiness, and kindled on any alarm of war. By such methods Bluetooth and Company's invasions were for a long while triumphantly, and even rapidly, one and all of them beaten back, till at length they seemed as if intending to cease altogether, and leave Hakon alone of them. But such was not their issue after all. The sons of Eric had only abated under constant discouragement, had not finally left off from what seemed their one great feasibility in life. Gunhild, their mother, was still with them, a most contriving, fierce-minded, irreconcilable woman, diligent and urgent on them, in season and out of season, and as for King Bluetooth, he was at all times ready to help, with his goodwill at least. That of the alarm fires on Hakon's part was found troublesome by his people. Sometimes it was even hurtful and provoking, lighting your alarm fires and rousing the whole coast and population, when it was nothing but some paltry Viking with a couple of ships. In short, the alarm signal system fell into disuse, and good King Hakon himself, in the first place, paid the penalty. It is counted, by the latest commentators, to have been about A.D. 961, 16th or 17th year of Hakon's pious, valiant, and worthy reign. Being at a feast one day, with many guests, on the island of Stord, sudden announcement came to him that ships from the south were approaching in quantity, and evidently ships of war. This was the biggest of all the Bluetooth foster-son invasions, and it was fatal to Hakon the Good that night. Eyvind the Skaldaspillir, annihilator of all other Skalds, in his famed Hakon's Song, gives account, and still more pertinently, the always practical Snorro. Danes in great multitude, 6 to 1, as people afterwards computed, springing swiftly to land, and ranking themselves; Hakon, nevertheless, at once deciding not to take his ships and run, but to fight there, 1 to 6, fighting accordingly in his most splendid manner, and at last gloriously prevailing, routing and scattering back to their ships and flight homeward those 6 to 1 Danes. During the struggle of the fight, says Snorro, he was very conspicuous among other men, and while the sun shone, his bright gilded helmet glanced, and thereby many weapons were directed at him. One of his henchmen, Eyvind Finnson, i.e. Skaldaspillir the poet, took a hat and put it over the king's helmet. Now, among the hostile first leaders were 2 uncles of the Ericssons, brothers of Gunhild, great champions both. Skreya, the elder of them, on the disappearance of the glittering helmet, shouted boastfully, "Does the king of the Norsemen hide himself, then, or has he fled? Where now is the golden helmet?" And so saying, Skreya, and his brother Alf with him, pushed on like fools or madmen. The king said, "Come on in that way, and ye shall find the king of the Norsemen." And in a short space of time braggart Skreya did come up, swinging his sword, and made a cut at the king; but Thorolf the Strong, an Icelander, who fought at the king's side, dashed his shield so hard against Skreya that he tottered with the shock. On the same instant the king takes his sword Quernbiter, able to cut querns or millstones, with both hands, and hews Skreya through helm and head, cleaving him down to the shoulders. Thorolf also slew Alf. That was what they got by such over-hasty search for the king of the Norsemen. Snorro considers the fall of these 2 champion uncles as the crisis of the fight, the Danish force being much disheartened by such a sight, and King Hakon now pressing on so hard that men gave way before him. The battle on the Ericsson part became a whirl of recoil, and in a few minutes more a torrent of mere flight and haste to get on board their ships, and put to sea again, in which operation many of them were drowned, says Snorro, survivors making instant sail for Denmark in that sad condition. This seems to have been King Hakon's finest battle, and the most conspicuous of his victories, due not a little to his own grand qualities shown on the occasion. But alas, it was his last also. He was still zealously directing the chase of that mad Danish flight, or whirl of recoil toward their ships, when an arrow, shot most likely at a venture, hit him under the left armpit, and this proved his death. He was helped into his ship, and made sail for Ericstad, where his chief residence in those parts was, but had to stop at a smaller place of his, which had been his mother's, and where he himself was born, a place called Hela, the flat rock, still known as Hakon's Hela, faint from loss of blood, and crushed down as he had never before felt. Having no son and only one daughter, he appointed these invasions of Eric to be sent for, and if he died to become king, but to spare his friends and kindred. "If a longer life be granted me," he said, "I will go out of this land to Christian men, and do penance for what I have committed against God. But if I die in the country of the heathen, let me have such burial as you yourselves think fittest." These are his last recorded words. And in heathen fashion he was buried, and besung by Eyvind and the Scalds, though himself a zealously Christian king. Hakon the Good, so one still finds him worthy of being called. The sorrow on Hakon's death, Snorro tells us, was so great and universal, that he was lamented both by friends and enemies, and they said that never again would Norway see such a king. Chapter 4. Harold Greyfell and Brothers. Eric's sons, 4 or 5 of them, with a Harold at the top, now once got Norway in hand, all of it but Trondheim, as king and under kings, and made a severe time of it for those who had been or seemed to be their enemies. Excellent Jarl Sigurd, always so useful to Hakon and his country, was killed by them, and they came to repent that before very long. The slain Sigurd left a son, Hakon, as Jarl, who became famous in the northern world by and by. This Hakon, and him only, would the Trondheimers accept as sovereign. Death to him, then, said the sons of Eric, but only in secret, till they had got their hands free and were ready, which was not yet for some years. Nay, Hakon, when actually attacked, made good resistance, and threatened to cause trouble. Nor did he by any means get his death from these sons of Eric at this time, or till long afterwards at all, from one of their kin, as it chanced. On the contrary, he fled to Denmark now, and by managed to come back to their cost. Among their other chief victims were 2 cousins of their own, Tryggve and Gudrod, who had been honest underkings to the late head king, Hakon the Good, but were now become suspect, and had to fight for their lives, and lose them in tragic manner. Tryggve had a son, whom we shall hear of. Gudrod, son of worthy Bjorn the chapman, was grandfather of St. Olaf, whom all men have heard of, who has a church in Southwark even, and another in Old Jewry to this hour. In all these violences, Gunhild, widow of the late King Eric, was understood to have a principal hand. She had come back to Norway with her sons, and naturally passed for the secret adviser and maternal president in whatever of violence went on, always reckoned a fell, vehement, relentless personage where her own interests were concerned. Probably, as things settled, her influence on affairs grew less. At least, one hopes so, and in the sagas hears less and less of her, and before long, nothing. Harold, the head king in this Eric fraternity, does not seem to have been a bad man, the contrary indeed, but his position was untowardly, full of difficulty and contradictions. Whatever Harold could accomplish for behoof of Christianity, or real benefit to Norway, in these cross circumstances, he seems to have done in a modest and honest manner. He got the name of Greyfell from his people on a very trivial account, but seemingly with perfect good humour on their part. Some Iceland trader had brought a cargo of furs to Trondheim, Lad, for sale. Sale being slacker than the Icelander wished, he presented a chosen specimen, cloak, doublet, or whatever it was, to Harold, who wore it with acceptance in public, and rapidly brought disposal of the Icelander's stock, and the surname of Greyfell to himself. His under-kings and he were certainly not popular, though I almost think Greyfell himself, in absence of his mother and the under-kings, might have been so. But here they all were, and had wrought great trouble in Norway. Too many of them, said everybody, too many of these courts and court people, eating up any substance that there is. For the seasons withal, 2 or 3 of them in succession were bad for grass, much more for grain, no herring came either, very cleanness of teeth was likely to come in Eyvind Skaldaspiller's opinion. This scarcity became at last their share of the great famine of A.D. 975, which desolated Western Europe. See the poem in the Saxon Chronicle. And all this by Eyvind Skaldaspiller, and the heathen Norse in general, was ascribed to anger of the heathen gods. Discontent in Norway, and especially in Eyvind Skaldaspiller, seems to have been very great. Whereupon exile Hakon, Jarl Sigurd's son, bestirs himself in Denmark, backed by old King Bluetooth, and begins invading and encroaching in a miscellaneous way, especially intriguing and contriving plots all round him. An unfathomably cunning kind of fellow, as well as an audacious and strong-handed. Intriguing in Trondheim, where he gets the under-king, Greyfell's brother, fallen upon and murdered, intriguing with Gold Harold, a distinguished cousin or nephew of King Bluetooth's, who had done fine Viking work, and gained such wealth that he got the epithet of Gold, and who now was infinitely desirous of a share in Bluetooth's kingdom as the proper finish to these sea rovings. He even ventured one day to make publicly a distinct proposal that way to King Harold Bluetooth himself, who flew into thunder and lightning at the mere mention of it, so that none durst speak to him for several days afterwards. Of both these Harolds Hakon was confidential friend, and needed all his skill to walk without immediate annihilation between such a pair of dragons, and work out Norway for himself withal. In the end, he found he must take solidly to Bluetooth's side of the question, and that they two must provide a recipe for Gold Harold and Norway both at once. "It is as much as your life is worth to speak again of sharing this Danish kingdom," said Hakon very privately to Gold Harold; "but could not you, my golden friend, be content with Norway for a kingdom, if one helped you to it?" "That could I well," answered Harold. "Then keep me these 9 warships you have just been rigging for a new Viking crews. Have these in readiness when I lift my finger." That was the recipe contrived for Gold Harold. Recipe for King Greyfell goes into the same vial, and is also ready. Hitherto the Hakon Bluetooth disturbances in Norway had amounted to but little. King Greyfell, a very active and valiant man, has constantly, without much difficulty, repelled these sporadic bits of troubles. But Greyfell, all the same, would willingly have peace with dangerous old, ever anxious to get his clutches over Norway on any terms, if peace with him could be had. Bluetooth, too, professes every willingness, inveigles Greyfell, he and Hakon do, to have a friendly meeting on the Danish borders, and not only settle all these quarrels, but generously settle Greyfell in certain fiefs which he claimed in Denmark itself, and so swear everlasting friendship. Greyfell joyfully complies, punctually appears at the appointed day in Limford Sound, the appointed place. Whereupon Hakon gives signal to Gold Harold, "To Limfjord with these 9 ships of yours, swift!" Gold Harold flies to Limfjord with his ships, challenges King Harold Greyfell to land and fight, which the undaunted Greyfell, though so far outnumbered, does, and fighting his very best, perishes there, he and almost all his people. Which done, Jarl Hakon, who is in readiness, attacks Gold Harold, the victorious but the wearied, easily beats Gold Harold, takes him prisoner, and instantly hangs and ends him, to the huge joy of King Bluetooth and Hakon, who now make instant voyage to Norway, drive all the brother underkings into rapid flight to the Orkneys, to any readiest shelter, and so, under the patronage of Bluetooth, Hakon, with the title of Jarl, becomes ruler of Norway. This foul treachery done on the brave and honest Harold Greyfell is by some dated about A.D. 969, by Munch 965, by others, shooting out of Snorro only, 975. For there is always an uncertainty in these Icelandic dates, say rather, rare and rude attempts at dating, without even an A.D. or other fixed year one to go upon in Iceland, though seldom, I think, so large a discrepancy as here.
Chapter 5 and 6 Chapter 5 Hakon Jarl Hakon Jarl, such the style he took, had engaged to pay some kind of tribute to King Bluetooth, if he could, but he never did pay any, pleading always the necessity of his own affairs, with which excuse, joined to Hakon's readiness in things less important, King Bluetooth managed to content himself, Hakon being always his good neighbor, at least, and the two mutually dependent. In Norway, Hakon, without the title of king, did in a strong-handed, steadfast, and at length successful way the office of one, governed Norway, some count for about 20 years, and, both at home and abroad, had much consideration through most of that time, especially amongst the heathen Orthodox, for Hakon Jarl himself was a zealous heathen, fixed in his mind against these chimerical Christian innovations and unsalutary changes of creed, and would have gladly trampled out all traces of what the last two kings, for Greyfell also was an English Christian after his sort, had done in this respect. But he wisely discerned that it was not possible, and that, for peace' sake, he must not even attempt it, but must strike preferably into perfect toleration, and that of every one getting to heaven or even to the other goal in his own way. He himself, it is well known, repaired many heathen temples, a great church builder in his way, manufactured many splendid idols, with much gilding and such artistic ornament as there was. In particular, one huge image of Thor, not forgetting the hammer and appendages, and such a collar, supposed of solid gold, which it was not quite, as we shall hear in time, round the neck of him as was never seen in all the North. How did his own jewel festivals, with what magnificent solemnity, the horse eatings, blood sprinklings, and other sacred rites need not be told. Something of a ritualist, one may perceive, perhaps had Scandinavian Puseyisms in him, and other desperate heathen notions. He was universally believed to have gone into magic, for one thing, and to have dangerous potencies derived from the devil himself. The dark heathen mind of him struggling vehemently in that strange element, not altogether so unlike our own in some points. For the rest, he was evidently, in practical matters, a man of sharp, clear insight, of steadfast resolution, diligence, promptitude, and managed his secular matters uncommonly well. Had 16 jarls under him, though himself only Hakon Jarl by title, and got obedience from them stricter than any king since Harfagr had done. Add to which that the country had years excellent for grass and crop, and that the herrings came in exuberance, tokens, to the thinking mind, that Hakon Jarl was a favourite of heaven. His fight with the far-famed Jomsvikings was his grandest exploit in public rumour. Jomsburg, a locality not known, except that it was near the mouth of the river Oder, denoted in those ages the impregnable castle of a certain hotly corporate, or sea robbery association limited, which for some generations held the Baltic in terror and plundered far beyond the belt. In the ocean itself, in Flanders, and the opulent trading havens there, above all, in opulent anarchic England, which, for 40 years from about this time, was the Pirates' Goschen, and yielded regularly every summer slaves, Danegeld, and miscellaneous plunder, like no other country Jomsburg or the Viking world had ever known. Palnatoke, Bue, and the other quasi-heroic heads of this establishment are still remembered in the northern parts. Palnatoke is the title of a tragedy by Oehlenschläger, which had its run of immortality in Copenhagen some 60 or 70 years ago. I judge the institution to have been in its flowery state, probably now in Hakon Jarl's time. Hakon Jarl and these pirates robbing Hakon's subjects and merchants that frequented him were naturally in quarrel, and frequent fightings had fallen out, not generally to the profit of the Jomsburgers, who at least determined on revenge, and the rooting out of this obstructive Hakon Jarl. They assembled in force at the Cape of Stad, in the Furdafylke, and the fight was dreadful in the extreme, noise of it filling all the north for long afterwards. Hakon, fighting like a lion, could scarcely hold his own. Death or victory, the word on both sides, when suddenly the heavens grew black, and there broke out a terrific storm of thunder and hail, appalling to the human mind. Universe swallowed wholly in black night. Only the momentary forked blazes, the thunder pealing as of Ragnarok, and the battering hail torrents, hailstones about the size of an egg. Thor with his hammer evidently acting, but in behalf of whom? The Jomsburgers in the hideous darkness, broken only by flashing thunderbolts, had a dismal apprehension that it was probably not on their behalf. Thor having a sense of justice in him, and before the storm ended 35 of their 70 ships sheered away, leaving gallant Boo with the other 35 to follow as they liked, who reproachfully hailed these fugitives, and continued the now hopeless battle. Boo's nose and lips were smashed or cut away. Boo managed half articulately to exclaim, "Ha! The maids of Funen will never kiss me more. Overboard, all ye boys men!" And taking his 2 sea chests, with all the gold he had gained in such life struggle from of old, sprang overboard accordingly, and finished the affair. Hakon Jarl's renown rose naturally to the transcendent pitch after this exploit. His people, I suppose chiefly the Christian part of them, whispered one to another with a shudder, that in the blackest of the thunderstorm he had taken his youngest little boy and made away with him, sacrificed him to Thor or some devil, and gained his victory by art magic or something worse. Jarl Eric, Hakon's eldest son, without suspicion of art magic, but already a distinguished Viking, became thrice distinguished by his style of sea fighting in this battle, and awakened great expectations in the Viking public. Of him we shall hear again. The Jomsburgers, one might fancy, after this sad clap went visibly down in the world, but the fact is not altogether so. Old King Bluetooth was now dead, died of a wound got in battle with his unnatural, so-called natural son and successor, Otto Svein of the Forked Beard, afterwards King and Conqueror of England for a little while, and seldom, perhaps never, had Vikingism been in such flower as now. This man's name is Sven in Swedish, Svend in German, and means boy or lad, the English Swain. It was at old Father Bluetooth's funeral ale, drunken burial feast, that Swain, carousing with his Jomsburg chiefs and other choice spirits, generally of the robber class, all risen into height of highest robber enthusiasm, pledged the vow to one another, Swain that he would conquer England, which in a sense he after a long struggling did, and the Jomsburgers that they would ruin and root out Hakon Jarl, which, as we have just seen, they could by no means do, and other guests other foolish things which proved equally unfeasible. Sea robber volunteers so especially abounding in that time, one perceives how easily the Jomsburgers could recruit themselves, build or refit new robber fleets, man them with the pick of crews, and steer for opulent, fruitful England, where, under Ethelbert the Unready, was such a field for profitable enterprise as the Viking public never had before or since. An idle question sometimes rises on me, idle enough, for it never can be answered in the affirmative or the negative, whether it was not these same refitted Jomsburgers who appeared some while after this at Redhead Point, on the shore of Angus, and sustained a new severe beating, in what the Scotch still faintly remember as their Battle of Loncarty. Beyond doubt a powerful Norse pirate armament dropped anchor at the Redhead, to the alarm of peaceable mortals, about that time. It was thought and hoped to be on its way for England, but it visibly hung on for several days, deliberating, as was thought, whether they would do this poorer coast the honour to land on it before going farther. Did land, and vigorously plunder and burn south-westward as far as Perth, laid siege to Perth, but brought out King Kenneth on them, and produced that Battle of Loncarty, which still dwells in vague memory among the Scots. Perhaps it might be the Jomsburgers, perhaps also not, for there were many pirate associations, lasting not from century to century like the Jomsburgers, but only for very limited periods, or from year to year. Indeed, it was mainly by such that the splendid thief harvest of England was reaped in this disastrous time. No Scottish chronicle gives the least of exact date to their famed victory of Loncarty, only that it was achieved by Kenneth III, which will mean some time between A.D. 975 and 994, and, by the order they put it in, probably soon after 975, or the beginning of this Kenneth's reign. Buchanan's narrative, carefully distilled from all the ancient Scottish sources, is of admirable quality for style, and otherwise quite brief, with perfect clearness, perfect credibility even, except that semi-miraculous appendage of the ploughman, Hay and Sons, always hanging to the tail of it, the grain of possible truth in which can now never be extracted by man's art. In brief, what we know is, fragments of ancient human bones and armor have occasionally been ploughed up in this locality, proof positive of ancient fighting here, and the fight fell out not long after Hakon's beating of the Jomsburgers at the Cape of Stad. And in such dim glimmer of wavering twilight, the question whether these of Loncarty were refitted Jomsburgers or not, must be left hanging. Loncarty is now the biggest bleach field in Queen Victoria's dominions. No village or hamlet there, only the huge bleaching house and a beautiful field, some 6 or 7 miles northwest of Perth, bordered by the beautiful Tay River on the one side and by its beautiful tributary Almond on the other. A Loncarty fitted either for bleaching linen or for a bit of fair duel between nations in those simple times. Whether our refitted Jomsburgers had the least thing to do with it is only matter of fancy, but if it were they who here again got a good beating, fancy would be glad to find herself fact. The old piratical kings of Denmark had been at the founding of Jomsburg, and to Svein of the Forked Beard it was still vitally important, but not so to the great Knut, or any king that followed, all of whom had better business than mere thieving, and it was Magnus the Good of Norway, a man of still higher anti-anarchic qualities, that annihilated it about a century later. Hakon Jarl, his chief labors in the world being over, is said to have become very dissolute in his elder days, especially in the matter of women. The wretched old fool, led away by idleness and fullness of bread, which to all of us are well said to be the parents of mischief. Having absolute power, he got into the habit of openly plundering men's pretty daughters and wives from them, and, after a few weeks, sending them back, greatly to the rage of the fierce Norse heart, had there been any means of resisting or revenging. It did, after a little while, prove the ruin and destruction of Hakon the Rich, as he was then called. It opened the door, namely, for entry of Olaf Tryggveson upon the scene, a very much grander man, in regard to whom the wiles and traps of Hakon proved to be a recipe, not on Tryggveson, but on the wily Hakon himself, as shall now be seen straightway. Chapter 6. Olaf Tryggveson. Hakon in late times had heard of a famous stirring person, victorious in various lands and seas, latterly united in sea robbery with Svein, Prince Royal of Denmark, afterwards King Svein of the Double Beard, or Fork Beard, both of whom had already done transcendent feats in the Viking way during his copartnery. The fame of Svein and this stirring personage, whose name was All, and recently their stupendous feats in plunder of England, siege of London, and other wonders and splendors of Viking glory and success, had gone all over the north, awakening the attention of Hakon and everybody there. The name of All was enigmatic, mysterious, and even dangerous looking to Hakon Jarl, who at length sent out a confidential spy to investigate this All, a feat which the confidential spy did completely accomplish, by no means to Hakon's profit. The mysterious All proved to be no other than Olaf, son of Tryggve, destined to blow Hakon Jarl suddenly into destruction, and become famous among the heroes of the Norse world. Of Olaf Tryggveson one always hopes there might, one day, some real outline of a biography be written, fished from the abysses where, as usual, it welters deep in foul neighborhood for the present. Farther on we intend a few words more upon the matter, but in this place all that concerns us in it limits itself to the two following facts. First, that Hakon's confidential spy found all in Dublin, picked acquaintance with him, got him to confess that he was actually Olaf, son of Tryggve, the Tryggve whom Blood Axe's fierce widow and her sons had murdered, got him gradually to own that perhaps an expedition into Norway might have its chances, and finally that, under such a wise and loyal guidance as his, the confidential spy's, whose friendship for Tryggveson was so indubitable, he, Tryggveson, would actually try it upon Hakon Jarl, the dissolute old scoundrel. Fact second is, that about the time they two set sail from Dublin on their Norway expedition, Hakon Jarl removed to Trondhjem, then called Lade, intending to pass some months there. Now just about the time when Tryggveson, spy and party had landed in Norway and were advancing upon Lade, with what support from the public could be got, dissolute old Hakon Jarl had heard of one Gudrun, a bonder's wife, unparalleled in beauty, who was called in those parts Sunbeam of the Grove, so inexpressibly lovely, and sent off a couple of thralls to bring her to him. Never, answered Gudrun, never, her indignant husband, in a tone dangerous and displeasing to these court thralls, who had to leave rapidly, but threatened to return in better strength before long. Whereupon, instantly, the indignant bonder and his Sunbeam of the Grove sent out their war arrow, rousing all the country into angry promptitude, and more than one perhaps into greedy hope of revenge for their own injuries. The rest of Hakon's history now rushes on with extreme rapidity. Sunbeam of the Grove, when next demanded of her bonder, has the whole neighborhood assembled in arms round her. Rumor of Tryggveson is fast making it the whole country. Hakon's insolent messengers are cut in pieces. Hakon finds he cannot fly under cover too soon. With a single slave he flies the same night. But whitherward? Can think of no safe place, except some old mistress of his, who lives retired in that neighborhood, and has some pity or regard for the wicked old Hakon. Old mistress does receive him, pities him, will do all she can to protect and hide him. But how, by what uttermost stretch of female artifice, hide him here? Every one will search here first of all. Old mistress, by the slave's help, extemporizes a cellar under the floor of her pig house, sticks Hakon and slave into that, as the one safe seclusion she can contrive. Hakon and slave, begranted by the pigs above them, tortured by the devils within and about them, passed 2 days in circumstances more and more horrible. For they heard, through their light slit and breathing slit, the triumph of Tryggveson proclaiming itself by Tryggveson's own lips, who had mounted a big boulder near by and was victoriously speaking to the people, winding up with a promise of honors and rewards to whoever should bring him wicked old Hakon's head. Wretched Hakon, justly suspecting his slave, tried to at least keep himself awake. Slave did keep himself awake, till Hakon dozed or slept, then swiftly cut off Hakon's head, and plunged out with it to the presence of Tryggveson. Tryggveson, detesting the traitor, useful as the treachery was, cut off the slave's head too, had it hung up along with Hakon's on the pinnacle of the Lade gallows, where the populace pelted both heads with stones and many curses, especially the more important of the two. Hakon the Bad ever henceforth, instead of Hakon the Rich. This was the end of Hakon Jarl, the last support of heathenry in Norway. Among other characteristics he had a strong-handed, hard-headed, very relentless, greedy and wicked being. He is reckoned to have ruled in Norway, or mainly ruled, either in the struggling or triumphant state, for about 30 years, 965 till 995. He and his seem to have formed, by chance rather than design, the chief opposition which the Harfagr posterity throughout its whole course experienced in Norway. Such the cost to them of killing good Jarl Sigurd in Greyfell's time. For curses like chickens do sometimes visibly come home to feed, as they always, either visibly or else invisibly, are punctually sure to do. Hakon Jarl is considerably connected with the Faroer saga, often mentioned there, and comes out perfectly in character, an altogether worldly wise man of the roughest type, not without a turn for practicality of kindness to those who would really be of use to him. His tendencies to magic also are not forgotten. Hakon left two sons, Eric and Svein, often also mentioned in this saga. On their father's death they fled to Sweden, to Denmark, and were busy stirring up troubles in those countries against Olaf Tryggvason, till at length, by a favourable combination, under their auspices chiefly, they got his brief and noble reign put an end to. Nay, furthermore, Jarl Eric left sons, especially an elder son, named also Eric, who proved a sore affliction and a continual stone of stumbling to a new generation of Hafaggers, and so continued the curse of Sigurd's murder upon them. Towards the end of this Hakon's reign it was that the discovery of America took place, 985. Actual discovery, it appears, by Eric the Red, an Icelander, concerning which there has been abundant investigation and discussion in our time. Ginnungagap, roaring abyss, is thought to be mouth of Bering Strait in Baffin's Bay. Big Hello Land, the coast of Cape Walsingham to near Newfoundland. Little Hello Land, Newfoundland itself. Markland was Lower Canada, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Southward thence to Chesapeake Bay was called Vineland. Wild grapes still grow in Rhode Island, and more luxuriantly farther south. White Man's Land, called also Great Ireland, is supposed to mean the two Carolinas, down to the southern cape of Florida. In Dalman's opinion, the Irish themselves might even pretend to have probably been the first discoverers of America. They had evidently got to Iceland itself before the Norse exiles found it out. It appears to be certain that, from the end of the 10th century to the early part of the 14th, there was a dim knowledge of those distant shores extant in the Norse mind, and even some struggling series of visits thither by roving Norsemen, though, as only danger, difficulty, and no profit resulted, the visits ceased, and the whole matter sank into oblivion, and, but for the Icelandic talent of writing in the long winter nights, would never have been heard of by posterity at all.
Chapter 7. Reign of Olaf Tryggvason. Olaf Tryggvason, A.D. 995 to 1000, also makes a great figure in the Faur saga, and recounts there his early troubles, which were strange and many. He is still reckoned a grand hero of the north, though his vates now is only Snorro Sturluson of Iceland. Tryggvason had indeed many adventures in the world. His poor mother, Astrid, was obliged to fly, on murder of her husband by Gunhild, to fly for her life 3 months before he, her little Olaf, was born. She lay concealed in reedy islands, fled through trackless forests, reached her father's with the little baby in her arms, and lay deep hidden there, tended only by her father himself, Gunhild's pursuit being so incessant, and keen as with sleuth-hounds. Poor Astrid had to fly again, deviously to Sweden, to Astland, Esthonia, to Russia. In Astland she was sold as a slave, quite parted from her boy, who also was sold, and again sold, but did at last fall in with a kinsman high in the Russian service, did from him find redemption and help, and so rose in a distinguished manner to manhood, victorious self-help, and recovery of his kingdom at last. He even met his mother again, he as King of Norway, she as one wonderfully lifted out of darkness into new life and happiness still in store. Grown to manhood, Tryggvason, now become acquainted with his birth, and with his, alas, hopeless claims, left Russia for the one profession open to him, that of sea robbery, and did feats without number in that questionable line in many seas and scenes, in England latterly, and most conspicuously of all. In one of his courses thither, after long labours in the Hebrides, Man, Wales, and down the western shores to the very Land's End and farther, he paused at the Scilly Islands for a little while. He was told of a wonderful Christian hermit living strangely in these sea solitudes, had the curiosity to seek him out, examine, question, and discourse with him, and, after some reflection, accepted Christian baptism from the venerable man. In Snorro the story is involved in miracle, rumour, and fable, but the fact itself seems certain, and is very interesting, the great, wild, noble soul of fierce Olaf opening to this wonderful gospel of tidings from beyond the world, tidings which infinitely transcended all else he had ever heard or dreamt of. It seems certain he was baptized here, date not fixable, shortly before poor heartbroken Dunstan's death, or shortly after, most English churches, monasteries especially, lying burnt, under continual visitation of the Danes. Olaf, such baptism notwithstanding, did not quit his Viking profession; indeed, what other was there for him in the world, as yet? We mentioned his occasional copartneries with Svein of the Double Beard, now become King of Denmark; but the greatest of these, and the alone interesting at this time, is their joint invasion of England, and Tryggveson's exploits and fortunes there some years after that adventure of baptism in the Scilly Isles. Svein and he were above a year in England together; this time, they steered up the Thames with 300 ships and many fighters. Siege, or at least furious assault, of London was their first or main enterprise, but it did not succeed. The Saxon Chronicles gives date to it, A.D. 994, and names expressly, as Svein's copartner, Olaus, King of Norway, which he was as yet far from being; but in regard to the year of grace the Saxon Chronicle is held to be indisputable, and indeed has the field to itself in this matter. Famed Olaf Tryggveson, seen visibly at the siege of London, year 994, it throws a kind of momentary light to us over all that disastrous whirlpool of miseries and confusions, all dark and painful to the fancy otherwise. This big voyage and furious siege of London is Svein Doublebeard's first real attempt to fulfil that vow of his at Father Bluetooth's funeral ale, and conquer England, which it is a pity he could not yet do. Had London now fallen to him, it is pretty evident all England must have followed, and poor England, with Svein as king over it, been delivered from immeasurable woes, which had to last some 22 years farther, before this result could be arrived at. But finding London impregnable for the moment, no ship being able to get athwart the bridge, and many Danes perishing in the attempt to do it by swimming, Svein and Olaf turned to other enterprises, all England in a manner lying open to them, turn which way they liked. They burnt and plundered over Kent, over Hampshire, Sussex; they stormed far and wide, world lying all before them where to choose. Wretched Ethelred, as the one invention he could fall upon, offered them Danegelt, 16,000 pounds of silver this year, but it rose in other years as high as 48,000 pounds. The desperate Ethelred, a clear method of quenching fire by pouring oil on it. Svein and Olaf accepted, withdrew to Southampton, Olaf at least did, till the money was got ready. Strange to think of it, fierce Svein of the Double Beard, and conquest of England by himself, this had at last become the one salutary result which remained for that distracted, downtrodden, now utterly chaotic and anarchic country. A conquering Svein, followed by an ably and earnestly administrative, as well as conquering Canute, whom Dahlmann compares to Charlemagne, were thus by the mysterious destinies appointed the effective saviours of England. Tryggveson on this occasion was a good while at Southampton, and roamed extensively about, easily victorious over everything, if resistance were attempted, but finding little or none, and acting now in a peaceable or even friendly capacity. In the Southampton country he came in contact with the then Bishop of Winchester, afterwards Archbishop of Canterbury, excellent Elphagus, still dimly decipherable to us as a man of great natural discernment, piety, and inborn veracity, a hero soul, probably of real brotherhood with Olaf's own. He even made court visits to King Ethelred, one visit to him at Andover of a very serious nature. By Elphagus, as we can discover, he was introduced into the real depths of the Christian faith. Elphagus, with due solemnity of apparatus, in presence of the king at Andover, baptized Olaf anew, and to him Olaf engaged that he would never plunder in England any more, which promise, too, he kept. In fact, not long after, Svein's conquest of England being in an evidently forward state, Tryggveson, having made withal a great English or Irish marriage, a dowager princess who had voluntarily fallen in love with him, see Snorro for this fine romantic fact, mainly resided in our island for 2 or 3 years, or else in Dublin, in the precincts of the Danish court there in the sister isle. Accordingly it was in Dublin, as above noted, that Hakon's spy found him, and from the Liffey that his squadron sailed, through the Hebrides, through the Orkneys, plundering and baptizing in their strange way, towards such success as we have seen. Tryggveson made a stout and, in effect, victorious and glorious struggle for himself as king. Daily and hourly vigilant to do so, often enough by soft and even merry methods, for he was a witty, jocund man, and had a fine ringing laugh in him, and clear pregnant words ever ready; or if soft methods would not serve, then by hard and even hardest he put down a great deal of miscellaneous anarchy in Norway. It was especially busy against heathenism, devil worship, and its rites. This indeed may be called the focus and heart of all his royal endeavour in Norway, and of all the troubles he now had with his people there. For this was a serious, vital, all-comprehending matter, devil worship, a thing not to be tolerated one moment longer than you could by any method help. Olaf's success was intermittent, of varying complexion, but his effort, swift or slow, was strong and continual, and on the whole he did succeed. Take a sample or two of that wonderful conversion process. At one of the first things he found the Bonders all assembled in arms, resolute to the death seemingly, against his proposal and him. Tryggveson said little, waited impassive, "What your reasons are, good men." One zealous Bonder started up in passionate parliamentary eloquence, but after a sentence or two, broke down. One, and then another, and still another, remained all three staring in open-mouthed silence there. The peasant proprietors accepted the phenomenon as ludicrous, perhaps partly as miraculous withal, and consented to baptism this time. On another occasion of a thing, which had assembled near some heathen temple to meet him, temple where Hakon Jarl had done much repairing, and set up many idol figures and sumptuous ornaments, regardless of expense, especially a very big and splendid Thor, with massive gold collar round the neck of him, not the like of it in Norway. King Olaf Tryggveson was clamorously invited by the Bonders to step in there, enlighten his eyes, and partake of the sacred rites. Instead of which he rushed into the temple with his armed men, smashed down with his own battle-axe the god Thor, prostrate on the ground at one stroke, to set an example, and in a few minutes had the whole Hakon pantheon wrecked, packing up meanwhile all the gold and preciosities accumulated there, not forgetting Thor's illustrious gold collar, of which we shall hear again, and victoriously took the plunder home with him for his own royal uses and behoof of the state. In other cases, though a friend to strong measures, he had to hold in, and await the favourable moment. Thus, once, in beginning a parliamentary address, so soon as he came to touch upon Christianity, the Bonders rose in murmurs, in vociferous and jingling of arms, which quite drowned the royal voice, declared they had taken arms against King Hakon the Good to compel him to desist from his Christian proposals, and they did not think King Olaf a higher man than him, Hakon the Good. The king then said, he purposed coming to them next Yule to their great sacrificial feast, to see for himself what their customs were, which pacified the Bonders for this time. The appointed place of meeting was again a Hakon Jarl temple, not yet done to ruin, chief shrine in those Trondhjem parts, I believe. There should Tryggveson appear at Yule. Well, but before Yule came, Tryggveson made a great banquet in his palace at Trondhjem, and invited far and wide all manner of important persons out of the district as guests there. Banquet hardly done, Tryggveson gave some slight signal, upon which armed men strode in, seized 11 of these principal persons, and the king said, since he himself was to become a heathen again, and do sacrifice, it was his purpose to do it in the highest form, namely, that of human sacrifice, and this time not of slaves and malefactors, but of the best men in the country. In which stringent circumstances the 11 seized persons, and company at large, gave unanimous consent to baptism, straightway received the same, and abjured their idols, but were not permitted to go home till they had left in sons, brothers, and other precious relatives sufficient hostages in the king's hands. By unwearied industry of this and better kinds, Tryggveson had trampled down idolatry, so far as form went; how far in substance may be greatly doubted. But it is to be remembered withal, that always on the back of these compulsory adventures there followed English bishops, priests, and teachers, whereby, to the open-minded, conviction, to all degrees of it, was attained, while silence and passivity became the duty or necessity of the unconvinced party. In about 2 years Norway was all gone over with a rough harrow of conversion. Heathenism, at least, constrained to be silent and outwardly conformable. Tryggveson next turned his attention to Iceland, sent one Thangbrand, priest from Saxony, of wonderful qualities, military as well as theological, to try and convert Iceland. Thangbrand made a few converts, for Olaf had already many estimable Iceland friends, whom he liked much, and was much liked by, and conversion was the ready road to his favour. Thangbrand, I find, lodged with the Hall of Sida, formal acquaintance of Burnt Njal, whose saga has its admirers among us even now. Thangbrand converted Hall and 1 or 2 other leading men, but in general he was reckoned quarrelsome and blusterous rather than eloquent and piously convincing. 2 skalds of repute made biting lampoons upon Thangbrand, whom Thangbrand, by 2 opportunities that afforded, cut down and did death because of their skaldic quality. Another he killed with his own hand, I know not for what reason. In brief, after about a year, Thangbrand returned to Norway and King Olaf, declaring the Icelanders to be a perverse, satirical, and unconvertible people, having himself, the record says, been the death of 3 men there. King Olaf was in high rage at this result, but was persuaded by the Icelanders about him to try farther, and by a wilder instrument. He accordingly chose one Thormund, a pious, patient, and kindly man, who, within the next year or so, did actually accomplish the matter, namely, get Christianity, by open vote, declared at Thingvalla by the general Thing of Iceland there, the roar of a big thunderclap at the right moment rather helping the conclusion, if I recollect. Whereupon Olaf's joy was no doubt great. One general result of these successful operations was the discontent, to all manner of degrees, on the part of many Norse individuals, against this glorious and victorious, but peremptory and terrible king of theirs. Tryggveson, I fancy, did not much regard all that; a man of joyful, cheery temper, habitually contemptuous of danger. Another trivial misfortune that befell in these conversion operations, and became important to him, he did not even know of, and would have much despised if he had. It was this: Sigrid, Queen Dowager of Sweden, thought to be among the most shining women of the world, was also known for one of the most imperious, revengeful, and relentless, and had got for herself the name of Sigrid the Proud. In her high widowhood she had naturally many wooers, but treated them in a manner unexampled. 2 of her suitors, simultaneous 2, were King Harold Graensake, a cousin of King Tryggveson's, and a kind of king in some district, by sufferance of the late Hakon's. This luckless Graenske, and the then Russian sovereign as well, name not worth mentioning, were zealous suitors of Queen Dowager Sigrid, and were perversely slow to accept the negative, in which her heart was inexorable for both, though the expression of it could not be quite so emphatic. By ill luck for them they came once, from the far west, Graenske, from the far east, the Russian, and arrived both together at Sigrid's court, to prosecute their importunate, and to her odious and tiresome suit, much, how very much, to her impatience and disdain. She lodged them both in some old mansion, which she had contiguous, and got compendiously furnished for them, and there, I know not whether on the first, or on the second, or on what following night, this unparalleled Queen Sigrid had the house surrounded, set on fire, and the 2 suitors and their people burnt to ashes. No more bother from these 2 at least. This appears to be a fact, and it could not be unknown to Tryggveson. In spite of which, however, there went from Tryggveson, who was now a widower, some incipient marriage proposals to this proud widow, by whom they were favourably received, as from the brightest man in all the world they might seem worth being. Now, in one of these anti-heathen onslaughts of King Olaf's on the idol temples of Hakon, I think it was that case where Olaf's own battle-axe struck down the monstrous refulgent Thor, and conquered an immense gold ring from the neck of him, or from the door of his temple, A huge gold ring, at any rate, had come into Olaf's hands, and this he bethought him might be a pretty present to Queen Sigrid, the now favourable, though the proud. Sigrid received the ring with joy, fancied what a collar it would make for her own fair neck, but noticed that her two goldsmiths, weighing it on their fingers, exchanged a glance. "What is that?" exclaimed Queen Sigrid. "Nothing," answered they, or endeavoured to answer, dreading mischief. But Sigrid compelled them to break open the ring, and there was found, all along the inside of it, an occult ring of copper, not a heart of gold at all. "Ha!" said the proud queen, flinging it away, "he that can deceive in this manner, can deceive in many others," and was in hot wrath with Olaf, though by degrees again she took milder thoughts. Milder thoughts, we say, and consented to a meeting next autumn, at some half-way station, where their great business might be brought to a happy settlement and betrothment. Both Olaf Tryggveson and the High Dowager appear to have been tolerably of willing mind at this meeting, but Olaf interposed, what was always one condition with him: "Thou must consent to baptism, and give up thy idol gods." "They are the gods of all my forefathers," answered the lady. "Choose thou what gods thou pleasest, but leave me mine." Whereupon an altercation, and Tryggveson, as was his wont, towered up into shining wrath, and exclaimed at last: "Why should I care about thee, then, old-faced heathen creature?" and impatiently wagging his glove, hit her, or slightly switched her, on the face with it, and contemptuously turning away, walked out of the adventure. "This is a feat that may cost thee dear one day," said Sigrid, and in the end it came to do so, little as the magnificent Olaf deigned to think of it at that moment. One of the last scuffles I remember of Olaf's having with his refractory heathens was at a thing in Hordaland or Rogaland, far in the north, where the chief opposition hero was one Jarnskag, Ironbeard, Scottish, Ironshag, as it were. Here again was a grand heathen temple, Hakon Jarl's building, with a splendid Thor in it and much idol furniture. The king stated what was his constant wish here as elsewhere, but no sooner entered upon the subject of Christianity than universal murmur, rising into a clangor and violent dissent, interrupted him, and Ironbeard took up the discourse in reply. Ironbeard did not break down; on the contrary, he, with great brevity, emphasis, and clearness, signified that the proposal to reject their old gods was in the highest degree unacceptable to this thing, that it was contrary to bargain, withal, that if it were insisted on, they would have to fight with the king about it, and in fact were now ready to do so. In reply to this, Olaf, without word uttered, but merely with some signal to the trusty armed men he had with him, rushed off to the temple close at hand, burst into it, shutting the door behind him, smashed Thor and company to destruction, then reappearing victorious, found much confusion outside, and in particular, what was a most important item, the rugged Ironbeard done to death by Olaf's men in the interim. Which entirely disheartened the thing from fighting at that moment, having now no leader who dared to head them in so dangerous an enterprise. So that every one departed to digest his rage in silence as he could. Matters having cooled for a week or two, there was another thing held, in which King Olaf testified regret for the quarrel that had fallen out, readiness to pay what mulct was due by law for that unlucky homicide of Ironbeard by his people, and withal to take the fair daughter of Ironbeard to wife, if all would comply and be friends with him in other matters, which was the course resolved on as most convenient. Accept baptism, we; marry Jarnskag's daughter, you. This bargain held on both sides. The wedding, too, was celebrated, but that took a rather strange turn. On the morning of the bride night, Olaf, who had not been sleeping, though his fair partner thought he had, opened his eyes, and saw, with astonishment, the fair partner aiming a long knife ready to strike home upon him, which at once ended their wedding life, poor Demoiselle Ironbeard immediately bundling off with her attendants, home again, King Olaf into the apartment of his servants, mentioning there what had happened, and forbidding any of them to follow her. Olaf Tryggveson, though his kingdom was the smallest of the Norse three, had risen to a renown all over the Norse world, which neither he of Denmark nor he of Sweden could pretend to rival. A magnificent, far-shining man, more expert in all bodily exercises, as the Norse call them, than any man had ever been before him, or after was. Could keep 5 daggers in the air, always catching the proper 5th by its handle, and sending it aloft again, could shoot supremely, throw a javelin with either hand, and in fact in battle usually throw 2 together. These, with swimming, climbing, leaping, were the admirable fine arts of the North, in all which Tryggveson appears to have been the Raphael and the Michelangelo at once. Essentially definable, too, if we look well into him, as a wild bit of real heroism in such rude guise and environment, a high, true, and great human soul. A jovial burst of laughter in him, withal, a bright, airy, wise way of speech, dressed beautifully and with care, a man admired and loved exceedingly by those he liked, dreaded as death by those he did not like. Hardly any king, says Snorro, was ever so well obeyed, by one class out of zeal and love, by the rest out of dread. His glorious course, however, was not to last long. King Svein of the Double Beard had not yet completed his conquest of England, by no means yet, some 13 horrid years of that still before him, when over in Denmark he found that complaints against him and intricacies had risen, on the part principally of one Burislav, king of the Wends, far up the Baltic, and in a less degree with the king of Sweden and other minor individuals. Svein earnestly applied himself to settle these, and have his hands free. Burislav, an aged heathen gentleman, proved reasonable and conciliatory, so too the king of Sweden, and Dowager Queen Sigrid, his managing mother. Bargain in both these cases got sealed and crowned by marriage. Svein, who had become a widower lately, now wedded Sigrid, and might think, possibly enough, he had got a proud bargain, though a heathen one. Burislav also insisted on marriage with Princess Thyri, the Doublebeard's sister. Thyri, inexpressibly disinclined to wed an aged heathen of that stamp, pleaded hard with her brother, but the Double-bearded was inexorable. Thyri's wailings and entreaties went for nothing. With some guardian foster-brother, and a serving-maid or two, she had to go on this hated journey. Old Burislav, at sight of her, blazed out into marriage feasts of supreme magnificence, and was charmed to see her, but Thyri would not join the marriage party, refused to eat with it or sit with it at all, day after day for 6 days flatly refused, and after nightfall of the 6th, glided out with her foster-brother into the woods, into by-paths and inconceivable wanderings, and in effect got home to Denmark. Brother Svein was not for the moment there, probably enough gone to England again. But Thyri knew too well he would not allow her to stay here or anywhere that he could help, except with the old heathen she had just fled from. Thyri, looking round the world, saw no likely road for her but to Olaf Tryggveson in Norway, to beg protection from the most heroic man she knew of in the world. Olaf, except by renown, was not known to her, but by renown he well was. Olaf, at sight of her, promised protection and asylum against all mortals. Nay, in discoursing with Thyri, Olaf perceived more and more clearly what a fine, handsome being, soul and body, Thyri was, and in a short space of time winded up by proposing marriage to Thyri, who humbly, and we may fancy with what secret joy, consented to say yes, and become Queen of Norway. In the due months they had a little son, Harold, who, it is creditably recorded, was the joy of both his parents, but who, to their inexpressible sorrow, in about a year died, and vanished from them. This, and one other fact now to be mentioned, is all the wedded history we have of Thyri. The other fact is, that Thyri had, by inheritance or covenant, not depending on her marriage with old Burislav, considerable properties in Wendland, which she often reflected might be not a little behooveful to her here in Norway, where her civil list was probably but straitened. She spoke of this to her husband, but her husband would take no hold, merely made her gifts and said, "Pooh, pooh, can't we live without old Burislav and his Wendland properties?" So that the lady sank into ever deeper anxiety and eagerness about this Wendland project, took to weeping, sat weeping whole days, and when Olaf asked her, "What ails thee, then?" would answer, or did answer once, what a different man my father Harold Gormson was, vulgarly called Bluetooth, compared with some that are now kings. For no King Svein in the world would Harold Gormson have given up his own or his wife's just rights. Whereupon Tryggveson started up, exclaiming in some heat, "Of thy brother Svein I was never afraid. If Svein and I meet in contest, it will not be Svein, I believe, that conquers," and went off in a towering fume. Consented, however, at last, had to consent, to get his fine fleet equipped and armed, and decided to sail with it to Wendland to have speech and settlement with King Burislav. Tryggveson had already ships and navies that were the wonder of the North. Especially in building warships, the Crane, the Serpent, last of all the Long Serpent, he had for size, outward beauty, and inward perfection of equipment, transcended all example. This new sea expedition became an object of attention to all the neighbours, especially Queen Sigrid the Proud and Svein Doublebeard, her now king, were attentive to it. This insolent Tryggveson, Queen Sigrid would often say, had long been saying to her Svein, to marry thy sister without leave had or asked of thee, and now flaunting his war navies, as if he, king only of paltry Norway, were the big hero of the North. Why do you suffer it, you kings really great? By such persuasions and reiterations, King Svein of Norway, King Olaf of Sweden, and Jarl Eric, now a great man there, grown rich by prosperous sea robbery and other good management, were brought to take the matter up, combined strenuously for destruction of King Olaf Tryggveson on this grand Wendland project of his. Fleets and forces were with best diligence got ready, and withal a certain Jarl Sigwald of Jomsburg, chieftain of the Jomsvikings, a powerful, plausible, and cunning man, was appointed to find means of joining himself to Tryggveson's grand voyage, of getting into Tryggveson's confidence, and keeping Svein Doublebeard, Eric, and the Swedish king aware of all his movements. King Olaf Tryggveson, unacquainted with all this, sailed away in summer, with his splendid fleet, went through the Belts with a prosperous wind, under bright skies, to the admiration of both shores. Such a fleet, with its shining serpents, long and short, and perfection of equipment and appearance, the Baltic never saw before. Jarl Sigvald joined with new ships by the way, had, he too, a visit to King Burislav to pay, how could he ever do it in better company? And studiously and skilfully ingratiated himself with King Olaf. Old Burislav, when they arrived, proved altogether courteous, handsome, and amenable, agreed at once to Olaf's claims for his new queen, did the rites of hospitality with a generous plenitude to Olaf, who cheerily renewed acquaintance with that country, known to him in early days, the cradle of his fortunes in the Viking line, and found old friends there still surviving, joyful to meet him again. Jarl Sigvald encouraged these delays, King Svein and company not being yet quite ready. Get ready, Sigvald directed them, and they diligently did. Olaf's men, their business now done, were impatient to be home, and grudging every day of loitering there; but still, Sigvald pleased, such his power of flattery and cajoling Tryggveson, they could not get away. At length, Sigvald's secret messengers reporting all ready on the part of Svein and company, Olaf took farewell of Burislav and Vendland, and all gladly sailed away. Svein, Eric, and the Swedish king, with their combined fleets, lay in wait behind some cape in a safe little bay of some island, then called Svold, but not in our time to be found, the Baltic tumults in the 14th century having swallowed it, as some think, and leaving us uncertain whether it was in the neighbourhood of Rugen Island or in the Sound of Elsinore. There lay Svein, Eric, and company, waiting until Tryggveson and his fleet came up, Sigvald's spy messengers daily reporting what progress he and it had made. At length, one bright summer morning, the fleet made appearance, sailing in loose order, Sigvald, as one acquaintance with the shoal places, steering ahead, and showing them the way. Snorro rises into one of his pictorial fits, seized with enthusiasm at the thought of such a fleet, and reports to us largely in what order Tryggveson's winged coursers of the deep, in long series, for perhaps an hour or more, came on, and what the three potentates, from their knoll of vantage, said of each as it hove in sight. Svein thrice over guessed this and the other noble vessel to be the Long Serpent, Eric always correcting him, "No, that is not the Long Serpent yet," and aside always, "Nor shall you be lord of it, king, when it does come." The Long Serpent itself did make appearance. Eric, Svein, and the Swedish king hurried on board, and pushed out of their hiding place into the open sea. Treacherous Sigvald, at the beginning of all this, had suddenly doubled the cape of theirs, and struck into the bay out of sight, leaving the foremost Tryggveson's ships astonished, and uncertain what to do, if it were not simply to strike sail and wait till Olaf himself with the Long Serpent arrived. Olaf's chief captains, seeing the enemy's huge fleet come out, and how the matter lay, strongly advised King Olaf to elude this stroke of treachery, and with all sail hold on his course, fight being now on so unequal terms. Snorro says the king, high on the quarter-deck where he stood, replied, "Strike the sails! Never shall men of mine think of flight. I never fled from battle. Let God dispose of my life, but flight I will never take." And the battle with all fury went loose, and lasted hour after hour, till almost sunset, if I well recollect. Olaf stood on the Serpent's quarter-deck, says Snorro, high over the others. He had a gilt shield and a helmet inlaid with gold. Over his armour he had a short red coat, and was easily distinguished from other men. Snorro's account of the battle is altogether animated, graphic, and so minute that antiquaries gather from it, if so disposed, which we but little are, what the methods of North sea fighting were. their shooting of arrows, casting of javelins, pitching of big stones, ultimately boarding and mutually clashing and smashing, which it would not avail us to speak of here. Olaf stood conspicuous all day, throwing javelins of deadly aim with both hands at once, encouraging, fighting, and commanding like a highest sea king. The Danish fleet, the Swedish fleet, were, both of them, quickly dealt with, and successively withdrew out of shot range. And then Jarl Eric came up, and fiercely grappled with the Long Serpent, or rather with her surrounding comrades, and gradually, as they were beaten empty of men, with the Long Serpent herself. The fight grew ever fiercer, more furious. Eric was supplied with new men from the Swedes and Danes. Olaf had no such resource, except from the crews of his own beaten ships, and at length this also failed him, all his ships, excepting the Long Serpent, being beaten and emptied. Olaf fought on unyielding. Eric twice boarded him, was twice repulsed. Olaf kept his quarterdeck, unconquerable, though now left more and more hopeless, fatally short of help. A tall young man, called Einar Tambarskjolver, very celebrated and important afterwards in Norway, and already the best archer known, was kept busy with his bow. Twice he nearly shot Jarl Eric in his ship. "Shoot me that man," said Jarl Eric to a bowman near him, and just as Tambarskjolver was drawing his bow the third time, an arrow hit it in the middle and broke it in two. "What is this that is broken?" asked King Olaf. "Norway from thy hand, king," answered Tambarskjolver. Tryggveson's men, he observed with surprise, were striking violently on Eric's, but to no purpose. Nobody fell. "How is this?" asked Tryggveson. "Our swords are notched and blunted, king, they do not cut." Olaf stepped down to his arm-chest, delivered out new swords, and it was observed, as he did it, blood ran trickling from his wrist, but none knew where the wound was. Eric boarded a third time. Olaf, left with hardly more than one man, sprang overboard, one sees that red coat of his still glancing in the evening sun, and sank in the deep waters to his long rest. Rumour ran among his people that he still was not dead, grounding on some movement by the ships of that traitorous Sigvald. They fancied Olaf had dived beneath the keels of his enemies, and had got away with Sigvald, as Sigvald himself evidently did. Much was hoped, supposed, spoken, says one old mourning skald, but the truth was, Olaf Tryggveson was never seen in Norseland more. Strangely, he remains still a shining figure to us, the wildly beautifulest man, in body and soul, that one has ever heard of in the North. Chapters 8 and 9. Chapter 8. Jarls Eric and Svein. Jarl Eric, resplendent with this victory, not to speak of that over the Jomsburgers with his father long ago, was now made governor of Norway, governor or quasi-sovereign, with his brother, Jarl Svein, as a partner, who, however, took but little hand in governing, and under the patronage of Svein Doublebeard and the then Swedish king, Olaf his name, Sigrid the Proud his mother's, administered it, they say, with skill and prudence for above 14 years. Tryggveson's death is understood and laboriously computed to have happened in the year 1000, but there is no exact chronology in these things, but a continual uncertain guessing after such, so that one eye in history as regards them as if put out. Neither, indeed, have I yet had the luck to find any decipherable and intelligent map of Norway, so that the other eye of history is much blinded withal, and her path through these wild regions and epochs is an extremely dim and chaotic one. An evil that much demands remedying, and especially wants some first attempt at remedying, by inquirers into English history, the whole period from Egbert, the first Saxon king of England, on to Edward the Confessor, the last being everywhere completely interwoven with that of their mysterious, continually invasive Danes, as they call them, and inextricably unintelligible till these also get to be a little understood, and cease to be utterly dark, hideous, and mythical to us as they now are. King Olaf Tryggveson is the first Norseman who is expressly mentioned to have been in England by our English history books, new or old, and of him it is merely said that he had an interview with King Ethelred II at Andover, of a pacific and friendly nature, though it is absurdly added that the noble Olaf was converted to Christianity by that extremely stupid royal person. Greater contrast in an interview than this at Andover, between heroic Olaf Tryggveson and Ethelred the forever unready, was not perhaps seen in the terrestrial planet that day. Olaf, or Olas, or Anlaf, as they name him, did engage an oath to Ethelred not to invade England any more, and kept his promise, they farther say. essentially a truth, as we already know, though the circumstances were all different, and the promise was to a devout high priest, not to a crowned blockhead and cowardly do-nothing. One other Aulus I found mentioned in our books, 2 or 3 centuries before, at a time when there existed no such individual, not to speak of several Anlafs, who sometimes seem to mean Olaf and still oftener to mean nobody possible. Which occasions not a little obscurity in our early history, says the learned Selden. A thing remediable too, in which, if any Englishman of due genius, or even capacity for standing labour, who understood the Icelandic and Anglo-Saxon languages, would engage in it, he might do a great deal of good, and bring the matter to a comparatively lucid state. Vain aspirations, or perhaps not altogether vain. At the time of Olaf Tryggvason's death, and indeed long before, King Sven Doublebeard had always for chief enterprise the conquest of England, and followed it by fits with extreme violence and impetus, often advancing largely towards a successful conclusion, but never, for 13 years yet, getting it concluded. He possessed long since all England north of Watling Street, that is to say, Northumberland, East Anglia, naturally full of Danish settlers by this time, were fixedly his, Mercia, his oftener than not, Wessex itself, with all the coasts he was free to visit, and to burn and rob in at discretion. There or elsewhere, Ethelred the Unready had no battle in him whatever, and for 40 years after the beginning of his reign, England excelled in anarchic stupidity, murderous devastation, utter misery, platitude, and sluggish contemptibility, all the countries one has read of. Apparently a very opulent country too, a ready skill in such arts and fine arts as there were. Sven's very ships, they say, had their gold dragons, top-mast pennons, and other metallic splendours generally wrought for them in England. Unexampled prosperity, in the manufacture way, was not unknown there, it would seem. But coexisting with such spiritual bankruptcy as was also unexampled, one would hope. Read Lupus, Wulfstan, Archbishop of York's amazing sermon on the subject, addressed to contemporary audiences, setting forth such a state of things, sons selling their fathers, mothers, and sisters as slaves to the Danish robber, themselves living in debauchery, blusterous gluttony, and depravity, the details of which are well nigh incredible, though clearly stated as things generally known. The humour of these poor wretches sunk to a state of what we may call greasy desperation. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. The manner in which they treated their own English nuns, if young, good-looking, and captive to the Danes, buying them on a kind of brutish or subter-brutish, greatest happiness principle, for the moment, and by a joint stock arrangement, far transcends all human speech or imagination, and awakens in one the momentary red-hot thought, "The Danes served you right, ye accursed." The so-called soldiers, one finds, made not the least fight anywhere, could make none, led and guided as they were, and the generals were often enough traitors, always ignorant, and blockheads, were in the habit, when expressly commanded to fight, of taking physic, and declaring that nature was incapable of castor oil and battle both at once. This ought to be explained a little to the modern English and their war secretaries, who undertake the conduct of armies. The undeniable fact is, defeat on defeat was the constant fate of the English. During these 40 years not one battle in which they were not beaten. No gleam of victory or real resistance till the noble Edmund Ironside, whom it is always strange to me how such an Ethelred could produce for a son, made his appearance and ran his brief course, like a great and far-seen meteor, soon extinguished without result. No remedy for England in that base time, but yearly asking the victorious, plundering, burning, and murdering Danes, "How much money will you take to go away?" 30,000 pounds in silver, which the annual Danegelt soon rose to, continued to be about the average yearly sum, though generally on the increasing hand. In the last year I think it had risen to 72,000 pounds in silver, raised yearly by a tax, income tax of its kind, rudely levied, the worst of all remedies, good for the day only. Nay, there was one remedy still worse, which the miserable Ethelred once tried, that of massacring all the Danes settled in England, practically, of a few thousand or hundreds of them, by treachery in a kind of Sicilian Vespers, which issued, as such things usually do, in terrible monition to you not to try the like again; issued, namely, in redoubled fury on the Danish part, new fiercer invasion by Sweyn's Jarl Thorkel, then by Svein himself, which latter drove the miserable Ethelred with wife and family into Normandy, to wife's brother, the then duke there, and ended that miserable struggle by Svein's becoming King of England himself. Of this disgraceful measure, which it would appear has been immensely exaggerated in the English books, we can happily give the exact date, A.D. 1002, and also of Svein's victorious accession, A.D. 1013, pretty much the only benefit one gets out of contemplating such a set of objects. King Svein's first act was to levy a terribly increased income tax for the payment of his army. Svein was levying it with a strong-handed diligence, but had not yet done levying it, when at Gainsborough one night he suddenly died, once used to be said, by St. Edmund, murdered king of the East Angles, who could not bear to see his shrine and monastery of St. Edmundsbury plundered by the tyrant's tax-collectors, as they were on the point of being. In all ways impossible, however, Edmund's own death did not occur till 2 years after Svein's. Svein's death, by whatever cause, befell 1014, his fleet then lying in the Humber, and only Canute, his eldest son, hardly yet 18, count some, charge of it, who, on short counsel arrangement about this questionable kingdom of his, lifted anchor, made for Sandwich, a safer station at the moment, cut off the feet and noses, one shudders and hopes not, there being some discrepancy about it, of his numerous hostages that had been delivered to King Svein, set them ashore, and made for Denmark, his natural storehouse and stronghold, as the hopefullest first thing he could do. Canute soon returned from Denmark, with increase of force sufficient for the English problem, which latter he now ended in a victorious, and essentially, for himself and chaotic England, beneficial manner. Became widely known by and by, there and elsewhere, as Canute the Great, and is thought by judges of our day to have really merited that title. A most nimble, sharp-striking, clear-thinking, prudent, and effective man, who regulated this dismembered and distracted England in its church matters, in its state matters, like a real king. Had a standing army, House Carles, who were well paid, well drilled, and disciplined, capable of instantly quenching insurrection or breakage of the peace, and piously endeavoured, with a signal earnestness, and even devoutness, if we look well, to do justice to all men, and to make all men rest satisfied with justice. In a word, he successfully strapped up, by every true method and regulation, this miserable, dislocated, and dissevered mass of bleeding anarchy into something worthy to be called an England again, only that he died too soon, and a second conqueror of us all, still weightier of structure, and under improved auspices, became possible, and was needed here. To appearance, Canute himself was capable of being a Charlemagne of England and the North, as has been already said or quoted, had he only lived twice as long as he did. But his whole sum of years seems not to have exceeded 40. His father Svein of the Forkbeard is reckoned to have been 50 or 60 when St. Edmund finished him at Gainsborough. We now return to Norway, ashamed of this long circuit which has been a truancy more or less. Chapter 9. King Olaf the Thickset's Viking Days. King Harald Graenske, who, with another from Russia accidentally lodging beside him, got burned to death in Sweden, courting that unspeakable Sigrid the Proud, was third cousin or so to Tryggve, father of our heroic Olaf. Accurately counted, he is great-grandson of Bjorn the Chapman, first of Hagfargar's sons, whom Eric Bloodaxe made away with. His little kingdom, as he called it, was a district named the Greenland. He himself was one of those little Haarfager kinglets whom Hakon Jarl, much more Olaf Tryggvason, was content to leave reigning, since they would keep the peace with him. Harold had a loving wife of his own, Asta the name of her, soon expecting the birth of her and his pretty babe, named Olaf, at the time he went on that deplorable Swedish adventure, the foolish, fated creature, and ended self and kingdom altogether. Asta was greatly shocked, composed herself, however, married a new husband, Sigurd Syr, a kinglet, and a great-grandson of Harald Fairhair, a man of great wealth, prudence, and influence in those countries, in whose house, as favourite and well-beloved stepson, little Olaf was wholesomely and skilfully brought up. In Sigurd's house he had, withal, a special tutor entertained for him, one Rain, known as Rain the Far-travelled, by whom he could be trained, from the earliest basis, in Norse accomplishments and arts. New children came, one or two, but Olaf, from his mother, seems always to have known that he was the distinguished and royal article there. One day his foster-father, hurrying to leave home on business, hastily bade Olaf, no other being by, saddle his horse for him. Olaf went out with the saddle, chose the biggest he-goat about, saddled that, and brought it to the door by way of a horse. Old Sigurd, a most grave man, grinned sardonically at the sight. "Ha! I see thou hast no mind to take commands from me; thou art of too high a humour to take commands." To which, says Snorro, boy Olaf answered little except by laughing, till Sigurd saddled for himself and rode away. His mother, Asta, appears to have been a thoughtful, prudent woman, though always with fierce royalism at the bottom of her memory, and a secret implacability on that head. At the age of 12, Olaf went to sea, furnished with a little fleet, and skilful sea counsellor, expert old Rain, by his foster-father, and set out to push his fortune in the world. Rain was a steersman and counsellor in those incipient times, but the crew always called Olaf King, though at first, Snorro thinks, except it were in the hour of battle, he merely pulled an oar. He cruised and fought in this capacity on many seas and shores, passed several years, perhaps till the age of 19 or 20, in this wild element and way of life, fighting always in a glorious and most distinguished manner. In the hour of battle, diligent enough to amass property, as the Vikings termed it, and in the long days and nights of sailing, given over, it is likely to his own thoughts, and the unfathomable dialogue with the ever-moaning sea, not the worst high school a man could have, and indeed infinitely preferable to most that are going on even now, for a high and deep young soul. His first distinguished expedition was to Sweden, natural to go thither first, to avenge his poor father's death, were it nothing more. Which he did, the skalds say, in a distinguished manner, making victorious and handsome battle for himself, in entering Marel Lake, and in getting out of it again, after being frozen there all winter, showing still more surprising, almost miraculous contrivance and dexterity. This was the first of his glorious victories, of which the skalds reckon up some 14 or 13 very glorious indeed, mostly in the western and southern countries, most of all in England, till the name of Olaf Haraldsson became quite famous in the Viking and strategic world. He seems really to have learned the secrets of his trade, and to have been then and afterwards, for vigilance, contrivance, valour, and promptitude of execution, a superior fighter. Several exploits recorded of him betoken, in simple forms, what may be called military genius. The principal, and to us the alone interesting, of his exploits seem to have lain in England, and what is further notable, always on the anti-Svein side. English books do not mention him at all that I can find, but it is fairly creditable that, as the North records report, in the end of Ethelred's reign, he was the ally or hired general of Ethelred, and did a great deal of sea-fighting, watching, sailing, and sieging for this miserable king and Edmund Ironside, his son. Snorro says expressively, London, the impregnable city, had to be besieged again for Ethelred's behoof, in the interval between Svein's death and young Canut's getting back from Denmark, and that our Olaf Haraldsson was the great engineer and victorious captor of London on that singular occasion, London captured for the first time. The bridge, as usual, Snorro says, offered almost insuperable obstacles. But the engineering genius of Olaf contrived huge platforms of wainscoting, old walls of wooden houses in fact, bound together by withes. These, carried steadily aloft above the ships, will, thinks Olaf, considerably secure them and us from the destructive missiles, big boulder stones, and other mischief profusely showered down on us, till we get under the bridge with axes and cables, and do some good upon it. Olaf's plan was tried; most of the other ships, in spite of their wainscoting and withes, recoiled on reaching the bridge, so destructive were the boulder and other missile showers. But Olaf's ships and self got actually under the bridge, fixed all manner of cables there, and then, with the river current in their favour, and the frightened ships rallying to help in this safer part of the enterprise, tore out the important piles and props, and fairly broke the poor bridge, wholly or partly, down into the river, and its Danish defenders into immediate surrender. That is Snorro's account. On a previous occasion, Olaf had been deep in a hopeful combination with Ethelred's two younger sons, Alfred and Edward, afterwards King Edward the Confessor, that they should sally out from Normandy in strong force, unite with Olaf in ditto, and landing on the Thames, do something effectual for themselves. But impediments, bad weather or the like, disheartened the poor princes, and it came to nothing. Olaf was much in Normandy, what they then called Walland, a man held in honour by those Norman dukes. What amount of property he had amassed I do not know, but could prove, were it necessary, that he had acquired some tactical or even strategic faculty and real talent for war. At Limfjord, in Jutland, but some years after this, A.D. 1027, he had a sea battle with the great Canute himself, ships combined with floodgates, with roaring, artificial deluges, right well managed by King Olaf, which were within a hair's breadth of destroying Canute, now become a king and great, and did in effect send him instantly running. But of this more particularly by and by. What still surprises me is the mystery where Olaf, in this wandering, fighting, sea-roving life, acquired his deeply religious feeling, his intense adherence to the Christian faith. I suppose it had been in England, where many pious persons, priestly and other, were still to be met with, that Olaf had gathered these doctrines, and that in those his unfathomable dialogues with the ever-moaning ocean, they had struck root downwards in the soul of him, and borne fruit upwards to the degree so conspicuous afterwards. It is certain he became a deeply pious man during these long Viking cruises, and directed all his strength, when strength and authority were lent him, to establish the Christian religion in his country, and suppressing and abolishing Vikingism there, both of which objects, and their respective worth and unworth, he must himself have long known so well. It was in A.D. 1016 that Canute gained his last victory, at Ashton in Essex, where the earth pyramids and antique church near by still testify the thankful piety of Canute, or, at lowest, his joy at having won instead of lost and perished, as he was near doing there. And it was still this same year when the noble Edmund Ironside, after forced partition treaty in the Isle of Alney, got scandalously murdered, and Canute became indisputable sole king of England, and decisively settled himself to his work of governing there. In the year before either of which events, while all still hung uncertain for Canute, and even Eric, Jarl of Norway, had to be summoned in aid of him, in that year 1015, as one might naturally guess and as all Icelandic hints and indications lead us to date the thing, Olaf had decided to give up Vikingism in all its forms, to return to Norway, and try whether he could not assert the place and career that belonged to him there. Jarl Eric had vanished with all his war forces towards England, leaving only a boy, Hakon, as successor, and Sven, his own brother, a quiet man who had always avoided war. Olaf landed in Norway without obstacle, but decided to be quiet till he had himself examined and consulted friends. His reception by his mother Asta was of the kindest and proudest, and is lovingly described by Snorro. A pretty idyllic, or epic piece of Norse Homeric type. How Asta, hearing of her son's advent, set all her maids and menials to work at the top of their speed, dispatched a runner to the harvest field, where her husband Sigurd was, to warn him to come home and dress. How Sigurd was standing among his harvest folk, reapers and binders, and what he had on: broad slouch hat, with veil, against the midges, blue kirtle, hose of I forget what colour, with laced boots, and in his hand a stick with a silver head and ditto ring upon it, a personable old gentleman of the 11th century in those parts. Sigurd was cautious, prudently cunctatory, though heartily friendly in his counsel to Olaf as to the king question. Asta had a Spartan tone in her wild maternal heart, and assures Olaf that she, with a half-reproachful glance at Sigurd, will stand by him to the death in this his just and noble enterprise. Sigurd promises to consult farther in his neighbourhood, and to correspond by messages. The result is, Olaf resolutely pushing forward himself, resolves to call a Thing, and openly claim his kingship there. The Thing itself was willing enough; opposition parties do here and there bestir themselves, but Olaf is always swifter than they. 5 kinglets somewhere in the uplands, all descendants of Harfagar, but averse to break the peace, which Jarl Eric and Hakon Jarl both have always willingly allowed to peaceable people, seem to be the main opposition party. These 5 take the field against Olaf with what force they have. Olaf, one night, by beautiful celerity and strategic practice which a Friedrich or a Turin might have approved, surrounds these 5, and when morning breaks there is nothing for them but either death or else instant surrender, and swearing of fealty to King Olaf. Which latter branch of the alternative they gladly accept, the whole 5 of them, and go home again. This was a beautiful bit of war practice by King Olaf on land. By another stroke, still more compendious at sea, he had already settled poor young Hakon, and made him peaceable for a long while. Olaf, by diligent quest and spy messaging, had ascertained that Hakon, just returning from Denmark in farewell to Papa and Canute, both now under way for England, was coasting north towards Trondhjem, and intended on or about such a day to land in such and such a fjord towards the end of this Trondhjem voyage. Olaf at once mans 2 big ships, steers it through the narrow mouth of the said fjord, moors one ship on the north shore, another on the south, fixes a strong cable, well sunk under water, to the capstans of these 2, and in all quietness waits for Hakon. Before many hours, Hakon's royal or quasi-royal barge steers gaily into this fjord, is a little surprised, perhaps, to see within the jaws of it 2 big ships at anchor, but steers gallantly along, nothing doubting. Olaf, with the signal of all hands, works his 2 capstans, has this cable up high enough at the right moment, catches with it the keel of poor Hakon's barge, upsets it, empties it wholly into the sea. Wholly into the sea, saves Hakon, however, and his people from drowning, and brings them on board. His dialogue with poor young Hakon, especially poor young Hakon's responses, is very pretty. Shall I give it out of Snorro, and let the reader take it for as authentic as he can? It is at least the true image of it in authentic Snorro's head, little more than 2 centuries later. Jarl Hakon was led up to the king's ship. He was the handsomest man that could be seen. He had long hair as fine as silk, bound about his head with a gold ornament. When he sat down in the forehold, the king said to him, King, it is not false what is said of your family, that ye are handsome people to look at, but now your luck has deserted you. Hakon, it has always been the case that success is changeable, and there is no luck in the matter. It has gone with your family as with mine to have by turns the better lot. I am little beyond childhood in years, and at any rate we could not have defended ourselves, as we did not expect any attack on the way. It may turn out better with us another time. King, dost thou not apprehend that thou art in such a condition that, hereafter, there can be neither victory nor defeat for thee? Hakon, that is what only thou canst determine, King, according to thy pleasure. King, what wilt thou give me, Jarl, if for this time I let thee go, whole and unhurt? Hakon, what wilt thou take, King? King, nothing, except thou shalt leave the country, give up thy kingdom, and take an oath that thou wilt never go into battle against me. Jarl Hakon accepted the generous terms, went to England and King Canute, and kept his bargain for a good few years, though he was at last driven, by pressure of King Canute, to violate it, little to his profit, as we shall see. One victorious naval battle with Jarl Svein, and his adherents, who fled to Sweden, after his beating, battle not difficult to a skilful, hard-hitting king, was pretty much all the actual fighting Olaf had to do in this enterprise. He various times met angry bounders and refractory things with arms in their hand, but by skilful, firm management, perfectly patient but also perfectly ready to be active, he mostly managed without coming to strokes, and was universally recognized by Norway as its real king. A promising young man, and fit to be a king, thinks Snorro. Only of middle stature, almost rather shortish, but firm standing and stout build, so that they got to call him Olaf the Thick, meaning Olaf the thick-set or stout build, though his final epithet among them was infinitely higher. For the rest, a comely, earnest, prepossessing look, beautiful yellow hair in quantity, broad, honest face, of a complexion pure as snow and rose, stand them. He had a heavy task ahead, and needed all his qualities and fine gifts to get it done.